Hello, everyone. Today we'll continue talking about Sandel's wonderful book. We'll be discussing the chapter on Rawls. So let us begin. Rawls is a bit complicated, it's a bit dense, it's a bit hard to get a handle on what he's saying. So before we discuss him directly, let us talk about something relevant, namely moral contracts. Arguably, no one should disagree with the following claim. It is right, it is moral to comply with one's contract, to be faithful to one's word, to fulfill one's promises. Those are different ways of saying similar things. The good person, the virtuous person, does those things. That's not really contestable. The difficult question is, to what extent are those contracts absolutely binding? If one makes a promise, is breaking the promise wrong under any circumstance, under any conditions? A different way of asking this question is, how much moral weight do promises have? Clearly, they have moral weights. Clearly, contracts have moral weight. That is, they bind our behavior in a particular way. They have normative force. The crucial question for us is, how strong is that force? So a different way of asking that question is, how morally binding are our behavior? How morally binding are contracts? Here are some moral considerations that enables us to see the moral strength behind contracts. One is freedom. In ideal conditions, two agents come together and freely agree to engage in some kind of a scheme of action. They freely agree to do something together. Here's my example of a couple getting married. Marriage is a kind of contract. It's a lot more than that, but it's a kind of contract. In ideal conditions, both spouses are free to get married and exercise their freedom in getting married. If one of them is coerced into the kind of contract, the contract's not really binding, or at least it's a lot less binding than it would otherwise be. So the freedom of entering a contract is central to its moral status. It's part of what grounds its moral bindingness, its ability to make us be morally obliged or obligated to comply with those contracts. Another moral consideration is the conferring of a benefit. So if you make a sell transaction, you give money to someone in exchange of some service, and you make the contract, you're going to pay $10,000 for a car, and the person gives you the car. Now that you have the car, a benefit has been conferred unto you. So that creates moral bindiness as well. You ought to give the money back, partly because you have been given a benefit. So being given a benefit grounds part of the moral obligation for you to fulfill your side of the contract. And also resources used. If you make a deal with someone and they use a lot of resources to try to provide the product for you, even if you don't actually get the product, arguably the fact that that person thought that you were going to give them money and they used a lot of resources to build the product, those resources used in order to comply with the contract create more obligation on your part to fulfill, to go through the contract, even if you're kind of changing your mind, or you're thinking about changing your mind. That resources have been used creates a more obligation for you to go through with the contract. But here's a crucial observation. The fact that contracts are made, that you and I make a deal, does not suffice to determine that the deal is fair. Even if we're both perfectly free, even if the benefits have been conferred, and I acknowledge that, even if the resources that I use are acknowledged, even if those other ethical considerations are fulfilled, the mere fact that there's a deal going on, that I take the benefit to be worth a particular kind of commitment on my part, and that you likewise agree, that agreement is not sufficient for making the deal that we both agree to be a fair deal. Fairness in contracts can come apart and do come apart many times. And here are some of the considerations that illustrate how many times deals that are made are not fair. Contracts that are undertaken are not fair or just contracts. Many times in the real world, when people make contracts, there is one party that has more negotiating power. If you rent an apartment and the landlord is very wealthy, has a lot of apartments, the landlord has a lot more negotiating power than you do. If the landlord decides that next year he's going to increase the rent by 10%, He can just do that, and if you leave, it doesn't really matter. He has a lot of money, so he can decide to increase the rent by 10%, and he has a lot of power to back up that decision and try to make you engage in a new contract, a new deal, in which you'll pay 10 extra percent. And if you don't have a lot of money, you'll have a lot of options. You might not have a lot of negotiating power there. You might be forced or coerced into this position in which you either pay the 10% or have no place to stay. And a lot of deals are like that. A lot of actual deals in the market are between entities or parties that have a lot more negotiating power than others. Also, some parties have a lot more knowledge or time or recognition of the alternatives, have more alternatives. If you're a connoisseur of antiques, right, you know a lot of antiques and how much they're worth. You may go to like garage sales and look for antiques, right? And you might stumble upon this old lady that has this clock that has been used in her family for generations. And unbeknownst to her, is it like a great, a piece of antique, a great antique that is worth a lot of money. But she might not know that, right? And you know that. So you might approach her and say, hey, I'll give you, $50 for your clock, or something like that. And she would perhaps happily take the deal, thinking that the clock is not worth that much. But because she doesn't know that it is, right? You, who has more knowledge of the kind of contract you're entering, namely the value of the thing you're acquiring, you're in this position of more negotiating power. You have knowledge that enables you to better comprehend what you're getting into. And many times you can, and many times people do take advantage of that knowledge to make deals that are very unfair on their behalf, and they get a much greater benefit than is fair. But anyway, these are some of the considerations, ethical considerations, that illustrate that the mere fact that two people come together and make an agreement need not suffice for it to be a fair agreement. And the fact that there is a difference on inequality in negotiating power, knowledge, time, or alternatives illustrates that a lot of the actual contracts we undertake are not examples of fairness, but rather, limited decisions and in the conditions of under limited conditions. So Rawls observes that, and he puts forth as the ground of morality not actual contracts, but rather hypothetical contracts. And this goes back in the Kantian tradition. For Kant, consent is at the heart of treating others in a moral, ethical way, of respecting their autonomy. But it's not just actual consent. Not any kind of consent will do. It is consent in principle, in some kind of ideal conditions, when someone knows fully well the maxim upon which the other person is acting. Rawls takes that idea onward, and he says the kind of contract that is a fair contract is the one that's not actually made, like not all actual contracts are fair, but is the ones that would be made under conditions of equality, rationality, and full knowledge. In other words, that you make a contract with someone else does not ensure that it is fair. That you would have made that very contract had you known enough, had you had enough time and ability to reason and knowledge, and be treated as equal. That is no more negotiating power on each side of on each party. If you would have accepted that contract had you known enough, had you been treated as equal, and the one had more power than the other, and been acted rationally, then that contract would be fair and therefore morally binding. It is contracts that have that hypothetical contract. Those are the ones that are fair. Those are the ones that are more binding than actual contracts. And that's at the heart of Rawls. Rawls puts forth hypothetical contracts as a way of grounding fairness in relating to other people. So Rawls' basic idea is that a policy or institution or law or constitution, any kind of document or entity that mediates human interaction is a fair one and therefore a just one, only if it would have been accepted under ideal conditions by everyone involved in that policy, institution, practice. So it is the hypothetical consent of every single party involved in that institution policy that grants the moral status to that institution, to that policy. It is the hypothetical consent under ideal conditions of everyone involved that secures the moral status or fairness of that thing, the policy, institution, law. So let's spell that out and that a little bit more. Rawls, at the heart of his view, is that justice is grounded in fairness, and fairness is grounded in equality. To treat other people fairly is to treat them as equal, and to do so is to create a society in which justice reigns. And he puts forth kind of a method, a strategy for trying to identify what it is to treat someone equal and fair and therefore just. And here's his main idea. Here's the heart of his view. And it is the same thing we've been talking about, the hypothetical contracts. So he thinks that the principles of justice, that is the principles that govern a good society, good institutions, good policies, good laws, and so on, are the principles that would have been chosen, the hypothetical contract, would have been chosen under ideal conditions. What are those ideal conditions? Now he spells them out a little more carefully, and he gives it a label. Those ideal conditions he calls the original position. And the original position, he thinks, is a kind of a purely imaginative, hypothetical, not actual, case in which people prior to society kind of get together and agreed on how to build society, how to make a constitution, for example, how to devise the rules or principles that would govern all of social interactions in such a way that by agreeing to those principles, a fair society would come about. And build into that original position, like the way in which ideal agents will come together and make decisions, have the three things that we've discussed. Those ideal agents are equal. No one has more bargaining power than anyone else. They're fully rational. No one's pushed by anger and emotion and the passions. They're using the reason. They have full knowledge of the consequence of their decision. So no one knows more about the consequences of making a deal or accepting a policy. And here's something new. Here's something that was not discussed before. Here's something that Kant did not say, something that we did not illustrate before. But this is at the heart of Rawls. He calls this the veil of ignorance. The idea is that those agents that are coming together to arrange society in a particular way, to decide on, to agree upon the principles that will govern society, those agents do not know their particular stage in life or role in society. They don't know their race, they don't know their gender, they don't know their level of education, they don't know their religious affiliation, and so on. They don't know what kind of roles in society they will be playing when they make the decision for fairness. And the thought is a very intuitive thought. It's the thought that if you know how much you're going to be benefited by a policy or institution, you would naturally be more biased towards it. If you knew that you will be hurt or you get less benefits by a different policy or different institution, you would naturally not want to have it. And those natural biases are not grounded in fairness, they're grounded in selfishness. So a way for you to stop being selfish in your ethical decision making, and a way for you to be fair and treat everyone as equal, is to not know what kind of benefits you in particular will be getting, but rather to kind of universalize, to look at people in general and see how people in general would be treated by that policy, by that institution, by like the way of arranging society, without knowing which position you will be in. And the thought is that equalizes the field, that now people that make decisions that greatly benefit the wealthy, because they're wealthy, will no longer do that, because they don't know if they're the wealthy that would be highly benefited by those decisions, or the poor that are oppressed by those decisions. Rather, there's this equalizing in the very decision making for agreeing upon principles that govern society, a just society. So a different way of saying the same thing is that the veil of ignorance, the veil that those ideal agents have, that they don't know their stage in life, their role in society, it's there to help secure the moral perspective by removing morally irrelevant considerations for the moral decision. Those morally irrelevant considerations are the fact that I will be getting the benefit, or the people that look like me will be getting the benefit, or the people that have my gender will be getting the benefit, or the people that have my religion will be getting the benefit. Rather, those morally irrelevant considerations will be removed. And now the mere fact that someone is a person, they have dignity and value, that's the only relevant consideration. And now the way in which resources are going to be distributed of people are not going to be dependent upon my particularities, that my gender, my religion, and so on. In this, it seems very abstract, but there's something very intuitive here. And let me give you an example about buying furniture. So this happened to me and my wife a few years ago when we were looking for furniture so I can furnish the house that we're going to be moving in after we get married. And as we were going towards the furniture store, we started talking about what kinds of furniture to get. And something occurred to me. This was before reading Rawls. Now looking back, I had a Rawlsian thought, but something occurred to me. And what occurred to me was that we might be in a position of disagreement. I might, or she might, one of us might really love a piece, a couch, say, and the other one might really not like it, might despise it, might not be happy with it at all. And if we find ourselves in that position, it's going to be hard to know what to do. It's going to be hard to know how to go about solving the disagreement at that moment. And the person who really likes it might be tempted to say, well, why don't we endorse the following policy? If someone really loves the sofa, then we get it. And the person that really hates it might be very tempted to endorse a different policy. If one of us really hates the couch, then we don't get it. But if we both know the role that we're playing, that is whether we're the ones who really like the couch or the ones that really hate the couch, we have this bias, right? We have this bias towards the policy of, oh, if one of us really likes it, let's get it, or one of us really hates it, let's not get it. So that thought occurred to me before going to the furniture. So I talked to my wife and said, why don't we agree on a policy without knowing which of us would like it? But we haven't seen the furniture yet. We don't know which of us, if it ever happens, will really like the sofa and which of us would not. Let's agree on a policy now because it seems more fair that before we know which of those positions we'll have, we agree on a fair way of making decisions. And we both agree that the fair way was that if one of us really hated the piece, we would not buy it, even though the other person would love it. And we both thought, oh yeah, that's fair. And we thought it was fair precisely because we did not know which of us will be getting the benefit or not. And now when we were actually in the position of buying or not buying the piece of furniture, we already had a policy, a rule that helped govern our interactions in a fair way. That's a very basic Rawlsian insight. Okay, let me stop here. I'll see you next time.